that what is the concept of korban? That the Ramban explains, even if, as Rashi explains here, we're speaking of voluntary korbanos. They're not similar to the sin offering, to the guilt offering, which are specifically for kapara, for atonement. Nevertheless, every korban, every sacrifice has relevance to some level of atonement. The Gemara tells us there's an expression, en kapara ela bedam, that the atonement is determined by the sprinkling of the blood that you sprinkle on the Mizbeach. Why? Because just as the blood is the life source of every living creature, so when you sprinkle the blood of the animal, since the animal is the equivalent of the person, which means the person is giving of his life to God, willing to sacrifice for himself, the animal is instead of the person, and every korban one brings has to be predicated on vidui. One has to make a confession, because if one does not make the confession, the Gemara quotes a pasuk, Zevach Risham To'eva. The sacrifice of a Rasha is To'eva, is an abomination. Meaning, whenever you bring the korban, a person has to do tshuva for his sins, because the animal itself has a representation of the person. When the animal is slaughtered, the person has in mind, he deserves to be slaughtered. And when you sprinkle its blood, and the whole ritual is the with his blood is being sprinkled. And when you burn the animal on the Mizbeach, it's as if his remains are being burnt. What is the halacha if you sprinkle the blood and the meat becomes contaminated, or the meat of the animal goes lost? It's considered a valid korban. It's valid. Why is it valid? Because the essence of the korban is the sprinkle of the blood. When you sacrifice the meat, that's only considered the completion. The mitzvah is being done in a more complete way. Again, because ika kapara b'dam, because the main atonement is dependent upon the sprinkling of the blood. The animal itself is the equivalent of the person, and just as a person, as the pasuk says, ki damhu nefesh, that what is the nefesh? The nefesh, the life, lies in the blood. So when you sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach, you see it as if, and the person understands, it's as if his blood is being sprinkled on the mizbeach. But if we're speaking about a voluntary korban, it has no relevance to atonement. No, there's no perfect person. As Shlomo Melech tells us in Mishlei, ain't tzaddik b'ortza sheyaz tov lo yechta. There's no perfect tzaddik. So therefore, when you bring the korban, the Gemara explains the two terminologies used. One, it's called mikufya. There is a superficial level of atonement, even when you bring the non-obligatory korban, because it's to reinstate the person. For instance, a peace offering is to bring peace between Hashem and the Jewish people. That's what it's called, shlomim. Lavi shalom ben aviv and the Klal Yisrael, between your father or between your maker and the Jewish people. Ola, burnt offering, the Gemara tells us, although it's not an obligation, very often it atones for a negative commandment and for a lavanitik lasei. Even though you corrected it at some level, but to be fully reinstated, to be in good standing with Hashem, you bring this non-obligatory korban. It puts you in a better standing in the eyes of Hashem. Okay? So the question is this. I think I may have mentioned it. The Rechaim HaKodesh asks a question. The Medrash tells us that the world was created with mishpat, justice. Justice doesn't mean midas adin, with fairness, with a level of fairness. There's equity. So the question is, if a person sins, how does the Torah say you should bring an animal in your place and see the animal when it's slaughtered and its blood is sprinkled as if it's the person being slaughtered and his blood is being sprinkled, because that, to be fully reinstated, that's what you should need. But the Torah says, no, bring an animal in the place of the person. It seems to be it's not equity. It's the wrong thing. If the person himself deserves this level of punishment to be reinstated, how do you take an animal and use an animal in place of the person? It's not fair to the animal to actually absolve yourself with bringing of the animal? That's the question which is asked by the Orach Chaim HaKodesh. So Orach Chaim HaKodesh says a profound concept. He explains that when a person sins, the only reason why a person sins, meaning why do we have all these blind spots, and why do we rationalize and justify many things? Because a person at that moment, due to our evil inclination, we see things through a colored lens, and therefore we're not fully responsible for our behavior. It's like a foolishness, a semi-temporary insanity comes over the person, and we behave in a certain way, which is not acceptable. It's like very often you say to a person, why did you do it? After he did it, he did the wrong thing. You say, the truth is, I wasn't thinking. That's what the person would answer. A person who's an upright person. He says, I wasn't thinking. If I would have been thinking, I wouldn't have done it. Or a person would say, I shouldn't have done it. Now that you tell me, I shouldn't have done it. So you see, there's a certain disconnect between the person and his behavior very often. Bringing the korban is actually atones for that level of disconnect. Now, a korban is not valid unless one does tshuva, unless one makes a confession. So when you make a confession, what are you? Now you become, at that moment, you're fully in touch and fully appreciate the wrong you did, and you make a commitment not to do that again. So what have you reestablished yourself as Odom, as a human being? When you sinned, even inadvertently, it was due to what? It was lack of cognizance, lack of awareness at the time. So what is that action? That action is considered the act of an animal. So now, the context of sin is with the context of the act of an animal, meaning it's lacking in cognizance and focus, and that's what happened. Now that you come to the realization of the wrong that you did, so now you're in a position, in a state of mind, now you've been reinstated as a human being. So now you want to bring the animal to address the behavior of what? Of a cognizant human being, or the cognizance, or the lack of cognizance, which is the behavior of an animal. As a result of that, you can't take a human being for an animal's action. Therefore, the Torah says, what would be fair if the person appreciates the wrong that he did as the animal, now that he's the person, you can't take the person for the act of an animal, but rather you take the animal for the behavior and the act of the animal itself. Therefore, it's not considered inequitable when you take the animal in place of the person. That's the Orach Chaim HaKodesh. So all these species, which are only the three specific species, the ox and the sheep and the goat, which qualify as the only species which qualify for a korban, these animals represent the human being and represent the Jewish people for the sake of atonement. I pointed out that we find by Noach, when he came out of the Teva, out of the ark, he was told before he went in that he should take 7 of the kosher species and 2 of the non-kosher species, just male and female. And he understood that the reason why he had to take more of the kosher and non-kosher, that he was meant to bring sacrifices. When he comes out of the Teva, he's meant to bring the sacrifices from the additional numbers, and he did. So the 2, the male, female, that's to perpetuate the species. The additional animals, it was for the sake of korban. And as Torah tells us, he brought korbanos. When Adam had brought korbanos, did he bring sacrifice only of the domesticated species? It says all kosher species were 7. Every species that he had brought was 7. It was 7 animals, but he sacrificed additional were even the non-kosher species. When the Jew brings a korban, it's only shor kesef eis. It's the ox and the sheep, which includes the goat. Why Noach, when he brought his korban, it was any species, as long as it was a kosher species. And when we bring the korban in the Mishkan or the Beis Hamikdash, it can only be these 3 species: the ox, the goat, and the sheep. What's the difference? So you could say one very simple difference, that Noach, when he brought his sacrifices, what was that? It was a bummer. As we explained the other day, the animal that was brought in the Mishkan Beis Hamikdash was Lifnei Hashem. That was in the presence of God. In the presence of God, you only bring these three species. When Noach or a person builds his own private Mizbeach and brings a korban, what is that? That's not Lifnei Hashem. There you're serving God by bringing the animal. It's like doing any act of serving Hashem. It's not Lifnei Hashem. When it's Lifnei Hashem, it's only these three species. Why these three species? So the Midrash tells us, now what is the concept of korban? The Midrash tells us that you will never find by korban the appellation of Elokim. It's always korban l'Hashem. The concept of atonement is only within the context of Midas HaRachmim. Within the context of Midas Hadin, there's no such thing as korban. So that you bring the animal in the Mishkan or Beis Hamikdash, Lifnei Hashem, you're standing before God and you want to be atoned. That you're eligible to be atoned is only within the context of Midas HaRachmim. Within Midas Hadin, there's no such thing as to be atoned. As a result of that, these species have to be special species to merit the Midas HaRachmim. Why these three species? Now, Avram, when he hosted the angels, it says he took 3 calves. He fed the angels the tongues of 3 calves. Yitzchak, the Aked was Ayil. The ram is a sheep. And by Yaakov, when he came to take the blessings from his father, his mother said to him, bring for me 2 gedoy izim, 2 goats, and I will make delicacies for your father, that you should feed your father to receive the birthright, the blessings of the birthright. So because we find these 3 species, by Avram, the calf, which is the ox, and the sheep, the ram by the Akedah, and the goat by Yaakov, therefore these 3 species are the only 3 species which qualify as a korban in the Mishkan and Beis Hamikdash for that reason. So we see it's only why do we merit Midas HaRachmim is because these have a representation of each one of the Avos HaKadoshim. That's what we merit the Midas HaRachmim. And here it's Lifnei Hashem. So because it's when you stand before God and to be able to merit the Midas HaRachmim, it's only because this has that level of representation that we come with the Schus Avos. That because we have the Schus Avos, because each one of these species represents the Avos, therefore we merit the Midas HaRachmim when we bring the korban to merit atonement for that reason. That's why. But when you build a bama, you build your own animal, your own personal mizbeach, altar, wherever it is, it doesn't have to be these species. It doesn't even have to be necessarily, even if it's blemished. When you bring the korban in the Mishkan or Beis Hamikdash, it has to be tomim. It has to be perfect. Because just as Hashem is perfect, when you stand before Hashem, everything you do has to represent that level of perfection. So as Hashem is perfect, the animal, it also has to reflect that level of perfection.